Hello, everyone. Welcome to Credential Up Houston. My name is Margaret Ford Fisher. Our show today focuses on the work of children at risk in their 15th publication edition of Growing Up in Houston, assessing the quality of life of our children. Dr. Robert Sanborn, the president and CEO of Children at Risk, says that data must be the catalyst and starting point to any conversation regarding the well-being of our children. Well, joining us today is Ms. Kellie O'Quinn, the Director of Children at Risk Center for Social Measurement and Evaluation. So we will begin that conversation today and over the weeks discuss the interventions or lack thereof that influence the long-term quality of life of children at risk. Ms. O'Quinn, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I've long admired Dr. Sanborn and the work of Children at Risk, and I think in order to lay the foundation for our conversation as we talk about data and we look at the implications and the further ramifications of the research, we'd like to talk about the research and the research design and methodology that was used and the geographic reach of the study. Was it within the City of Houston limits, or did it include the greater Houston metropolitan area?
Sure, great question. So the book as a whole encompasses more than 100 different indicators on the well-being of children. So we've, over the past 30 years, when we began creating this publication, started with just a handful of indicators. Since that list has grown, we've talked to several different key stakeholders in different sectors of the community about what are the most pertinent indicators of child's well-being and success within education, within health and food access, within child safety, to get a sense of what are the ones we have to include. And then depending on different indicators, depends on which which geographic location is included. There are some that are just the Houston proper limits. There are some that are the greater Houston area that encompass all of Harris County. And there are still others that encompass kind of the 8 surrounding counties. So it's a little different. In every indicator we try to be sure to include, is this just Houston specifically? Is this Harris County, the greater Houston region? And so.
Okay, that's good. And roughly how many persons in that study, that sample group?
So we don't pull a sample. We look at data across the entire Houston region. So if we're pulling data about the education of children, we look at all public schools or all districts in the Houston area. If we're looking at, food access and food deserts, we look at the entire kind of Harris County region to understand. So we're not sampling from specific, a community here, community there. So we're really looking holistically at the greater Houston region.
Right, that's what I was going to say, the total population.
Exactly, so all of us. Exactly.
Very, very good. So as we look at the data, overall, what is that data saying about the well-being of our children?
Oh gosh. I think in some spaces our children are doing okay, but by and large, I think we have a long way to go for the well-being of our children. And I think that if we don't make changes, either in the way we practice as a community and implement different services and interventions, or if we don't actually change policies to support children, then we will be doing a disservice in the long term.
So policies such as, for example?
Sure. So, I think of one kind of small but very large example, right, is I think about the school finance. It's been a large piece of conversation this legislative session. And right now they're in conference committee and kind of at a stalemate. And if we don't actually figure out how to fund schools properly, that's doing a disservice to all of our children, right? Schools need proper funding to be able to function, right, and to be able to implement both teaching and other services for their students. So that's just one example, right, of if we don't get this right now, those children who are the future of our workforce, of our community, we're putting them at jeopardy.
So early childhood education,
sure.
that's one of the areas that you focused on in your research, and that is included in the most recent publication, which is really quite extraordinary. So tell us about what you're seeing there in early childhood education.
Sure. So early childhood education for us encompasses everything 0 to 5. So it really encompasses childcare, pre-K, kindergarten, and Head Start, early Head Start. People oftentimes think of early childhood education as just being pre-K, kindergarten, but there's so much more before you get into pre-K, right? We know the vast majority of a child's brain development happens in that 0 to 3 space. And so we as a community, as a state, have to pay attention to where those children are at when they're 0 to 3 and in what spaces they're in. So we've spent the last 3.5, almost 4 years focusing a lot of our time, energy, and resources on the childcare system in Texas. And just for a little bit of background and context, I won't go too much into the weeds. The federal government gives a child care block grant to each state to act as a workforce support primarily. In Texas, that's through the Texas Workforce Commission, because we really view child care as just that, a workforce support so that parents can go to work or go to school. And so we just recently had this shift where we're thinking about childcare really as part of education and about the child themselves. And so we are trying to really shift that some more, right? And focus and align what's happening in childcare to what's happening in pre-K and K. And so when we look at the Houston region specifically, while we may have childcare access for children, access for quality access for low-income children is really limited. There's what's called a quality rating system, or Texas Rising Star. And about 90% of Houston children who are in need of childcare don't have access to that quality space.
So you raised a number of very important points. and I really do appreciate that. What I'd like to go back to is the comment that you made earlier about the self-concept of a child being formed within the first 3 years. So that's critically important. So childcare then, early childhood education, becomes critically important. So once that self-concept is developed, it's formed, as a social worker, tell us, how difficult is it to change that?
So it's difficult, right? That's what you just asked. But when you are already developed, your neurons in your brain have already built their pathways. If you're trying to implement interventions on the back end, it is possible, but it's much more timely and much more costly to implement intervention services in the upper grades. If you can get to a child in a community and a family in those really early years, there's been a wealth of research to demonstrate that their learning, their behavior, their social emotional well-being and mental health will all be much better. That's why things like, I think, childcare or home visiting programs to support low-income families and thinking about nurturing and bonding and parenting skills is really, really important.
And so what are the credentials that are required for providers of early childhood education?
Sure. So childcare providers, childcare centers have to be licensed through the state. And then teachers in childcare centers, there are bare minimum requirements at the moment. I think there's about 36 hours that our teacher is required to go through childhood training, where in comparison to someone like, a nail technician, over hundreds of hours are required before she can, paint and do your nails. Not to minimize their work, right? But these are our children, and they are precious to us. And so there should be much more required when it comes to their care and well-being.
And I would imagine that not all providers have that training that is required to provide the quality care and the support for the young children in their care. And so that then becomes problematic, and that impacts the child's self-concept as well, especially in the early years. So what I would like for us to do is to talk about education in the next segment as well. And I'd like to focus on kindergarten through the 12th grade, because that's really critically important. With that self-concept being formed in the early stages, what impact will that have on young children as they move on into the higher grades of schooling? So, Ms. O'Quinn, thank you for a very good conversation. We're going to continue our conversation in the next segment, so please stay with us.
HCC. So many degrees, so little tuition. Register today at hccs.edu/now.
Did you know that Houston Community College has the largest enrollment of online community college students in the United States? Hi, I'm Paul Calhoun. The HCC Online College proudly enrolls over 20,000 students. We offer more than 30 online degree and certificate programs, as well as online student services, including admissions, advising, counseling, and technical support. HCC Online College, anywhere, anytime. For more information, visit our website, hccs.edu/online.
We have academic programs that help students get from high school into a university. And the data is very clear that students that take the path of a community college finish in far higher numbers than students that start straight into a university experience. Our students can achieve a baccalaureate degree in multiple fields from the universities in the area without ever leaving Houston Community College.
Welcome back to Credential Up Houston. We are so delighted that you are still with us. We're talking to Ms. Kellie O'Quinn, who's the Director of Research at Children at Risk. So in the last segment, we were talking about the early child care and how the self-concept is formed by age 3. And so as we move now from kindergarten to 12th grade, there are data in your report to indicate that over 40% of children are not ready to learn when they reach kindergarten. So let's talk about that and how we see that progressive pattern of students lagging behind due to lack of support in the early years.
Yeah, it definitely starts there, right? And it continues on up. And we know that if children are not reading by 3rd grade on reading level, then as they progress, right, they continue to fall further and further behind. This frequently leads to disengagement in middle school and high school, potentially dropping out, or maybe you skirt by and you graduate, but then you graduate and you're disconnected because you can't potentially make it in community college or a trade school or college. But I think that regardless of how a student comes in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, it's the job of the system, right, of their school, their district to support them in their learning, right, and to provide the interventions and the education that's really needed. And when we looked at, low-income schools, just 7-8 years ago, we didn't find any schools across the state that by our standards were high performing. Just 4 years ago, this was only, I think 12% of schools that were high performing. But now we see close to a quarter of high poverty schools are high performing. So there are things that systems can do, regardless of how a child comes into them, right, to be successful and to support their students' academic learning.
So let's define what a high performing school would have as a set of criteria.
Absolutely. So I'll back up and say that Children at Risk has been ranking and grading all public schools, including charters, for the past, I believe, 12 or 13 years. And so in our methodology, we look at raw academic achievement in relation to levels of poverty at a campus, how students are growing and getting better year over year. And then for high schools, we throw in a college readiness index that looks at graduation rates, AP, IB tests, and then SAT and ACT scores. So we look at all of those in accumulation. For us, a high-performing school is an A or a B in our rankings. And there's our set of, not criteria, but when we look at these high-performing schools, there are common best practices that these campuses that are high-performing are using and implementing across their campuses to achieve and maintain that success for them.
So as we look at that success in the high-poverty schools, we know that there are young people who come from impoverished backgrounds who do extraordinarily well. They achieve great accomplishments in life. And you look at the family and you might equate those families to some of the families that we're talking about now. So what makes that difference in your estimation? Is it the teacher, the schools, the parenting? What are your assumptions about that?
I think it's a combination of all of them. I think that children that are successful frequently have a parent or a caregiver that loves them and is encouraging them and pushing them. But sometimes you have students that are really successful that maybe don't have that. And so to say it's just the parent's responsibility, I don't think is fair to parents to put that burden on them, right? I think it's a combination of parents, of schools, leaders at a school, teachers that are all supporting children to help them do well. And it's really about kind of different practices they're implementing. So things that come to mind are teachers and principals that set a culture of high expectations. There's been a lot of research that shows that when you set low expectations for students, they will kind of just meet those and not really rise to what they're capable of. But if you set really high expectations, they will rise and they will meet those oftentimes. And so if we are coming into low-income schools and saying, well, it's fine, they can't really do well anyway, don't bother, then students feel that. I talked to a parent a few weeks ago and they said, is this normal? My child told me that their teacher said, just don't worry about tutorials. You can't learn anyway. So if we have teachers that are saying that, right, kids are going to take that to heart. Whereas instead, if we have teachers that are coming in and saying, you can learn, I believe in you, like, let's do this together, I'll help you. And they will put in the work and they will oftentimes do well. And so you see that happening at these campuses.
And so that's the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely.
That is indeed very active in many settings, sometimes in the home, where the parents are not giving those positive messages on a regular basis, and in the schools. And you can see it non-verbally as well. I mean, it doesn't have to be communicated verbally, but non-verbally. The young people can pick up on whether or not they're going to be supported or not.
Absolutely.
So now, as we look at the opportunity youth, how does that factor into what we were just saying about students who feel disconnected? They don't feel successful in school.
Yeah, so I was actually just talking to a few colleagues about this a few weeks ago, and that it really does start in those early years, right? And opportunity youth is really just kind of the new way of thinking about, in some regards in high school, like those that are at risk of dropping out. And so if you are disconnected, if you are, have no social connection between people that are around you, whether peers or teachers, or if you are disconnected in the sense that you're not learning and feel like you can't learn, what's the incentive to be in school every day? That then leads to things like dropping out or barely skirting by, and okay, I graduate, but there's nothing else really out there for me. I've been told all along there's nothing out there for me, so I'm just gonna go do who knows what, right? It's kind of what we're struggling to find out right now, is where these students are at, or these young adults are at.
How unfortunate.
Yes.
The loss of generations for the most part. You also, in the report, make that analysis and present the data on the performance of charter schools and public schools, which I found quite interesting. So just share some information about that with us. It seems as though charter schools are performing very well in many instances to usher students through to success. So what are they doing, in order to accomplish that?
Sure. Well, so I would first back up and go back to some of the data, in that when we look at all public schools across the state specifically, about 43% of them are getting an A or a B in our rankings of all schools, and a quarter of high poverty schools are getting an A or a B. When you look at charter schools, of all charter schools, only half of them get an A or a B. So we kind of have this mindset and this idea that, well, charters are doing a great job. They're here to kind of, quote unquote, save the day or be innovative. When in reality, there are far too many charter schools that are not supporting students, and that are, in some regards, taking resources when they're not doing what I think their job is to do.
Okay, and so they could learn from the practices of the public schools.
I think they could learn from the practices of both high-performing charters and what we call gold ribbon schools, our high-performing, high-poverty campuses.
Certainly. So now this data
Sure.
will have implications for those students who transition on into community colleges and universities as well. And I know your work primarily focuses on up to the 12th grade.
Sure.
So, but as a social worker, I would like for you to speculate. How does this carry over, and what would be the impact once you have some of the young people who come to community colleges or go on to universities?
That's a great question, and I think a huge opportunity for us as a society to better support these young people. So I'll take food insecurity as an example, right? Right now, children who are food insecure have access to school food programs through breakfast programs, lunch programs, and after-school programs, and summer as well. When they turn 18 and graduate high school and go to college or community college, they don't suddenly become food secure, right? In fact, they may become even more food insecure, right? They no longer are living potentially with their families. They don't have the support of school food programs. They're going to college. And so how do we think about how colleges can then support the needs of their students in other ways that are non-academic?
Very, very good point. We're going to continue on the transition to college life, post-secondary education, and we're also going to talk about mental health.
Sure.
But we're going to take a break and we'll be right back, so please stay with us.
HCC. So many careers, so little tuition. Register today at hccs.edu/now.
I've seen people's lives change just by attending a class at HCC.
Some of them might not have the financial means to go to a four-year university. That doesn't make them any less quote-unquote smart than the kids who go to a four-year school.
HCC is easy to get to. It's easy to apply and easy to become a part of.
It gave me so much confidence.
Once you finish your 2 years there, you can transition into a four-year university or go into the workforce.
It's affordable, it's accessible, it changes lives.
HCC. So many classes, so little tuition. Register today at hccs.edu/now.
Welcome back to Credential Up Houston. Today we're talking with Ms. Kellie O'Quinn, who's Director of Children at Risk, the Research Center for Social Measurement and Evaluation. And during the last segment, we were talking about the transition of students from the 12th grade, secondary school, into post-secondary education, and some of the support systems that would be needed. And one of them you indicated would be to provide the food access and availability for them. What are some of the other recommendations, Ms. O'Quinn?
Sure, I think things like healthcare access, right? I think you have some really large universities that have a healthcare center on campus for students, but other smaller ones don't. Or access to mental and behavioral health care, or access to kind of a mentor or kind of a friend that will support them through the system, right? Especially for students that are first-generation college students. Maybe this is a whole new world to them, and culturally figuring out, how do I fit in to this college life? What does this look like for me? How do I connect with those around me, right? How do I succeed? I used to be maybe the top of my class in my high school, and now I come in and I'm kind of a fish in a big pond. And so I think those are some of the things that could be helpful.
You know, you touched on critically important points, because a lot of the disconnected youth would perhaps need that hand-holding, that support, that compassion, additional services as well that would aid them through their educational program. Perhaps as we look at young people and we talk about that self-validation, which is critically important. It sounds to me like that self-validation would be more important for those students who had low self-concept, conceivably, than those who grew up in a family environment where they were nurtured and they were, you know, always embraced and told about how bright they are. So has self-validation been included in the work that you do and the significance associated with that?
Sure, we haven't looked specifically at that, especially as it relates to kind of opportunity youth. What I will say is that I think students and children in general that have high self-esteem, it's important for all of them, right? I think part of that comes back to the mental health access piece. And I would say that that is important for all children and not just the ones that maybe are in families or spaces where they're not getting the validation in other places.
You're right. Now, one piece of your work that we have not touched on yet pertains to safety and security. We know that for young people who come from low-income homes and communities, frequently have to go from the school back into an environment where they have to be concerned about safety issues. They have to be concerned, as you had mentioned before, about many of the other distractors. So what impact have you found that poverty has generally on success?
Sure, so I think poverty, it really does kind of lead to reduced success, but not because of a deficiency of a community or of an individual or a family, right? When we think about poverty, poverty is a result of systems and policies that are in place, and so those directly impact the success and well-being of children, whether that's safety and community violence, or whether that's lack of sidewalks in a community and the inability to walk safely from school to my home, or whether that is a number of illegal sexually oriented businesses that are on my route from school to home, putting me at risk for things like human trafficking. But those are all results of policy, whether that be zoning or funds to build sidewalks, or environmental policies that put a plant next to my home and my school, right? But they have a direct impact, but there are policies that are creating those, and there are policies and systems that are in place that we're trying to put in place, right, to mitigate those impacts.
Well, that is really very important.
Get me on my soapbox.
And so, yeah, well, I'm going to give you an opportunity to continue there then. If that's so what I'd like for you to do is to give us recommendations. We're about to close the program today, and I'd like for you to share recommendations that are really critically important in about 30 seconds or so.
Sure, so some recommendations, I'll touch on a couple. Back to the early childhood education we talked about first, is to support and increase access to the quality child care. And there's a host of ways we could dive into that for a whole half hour. I would touch on mental health access and really expanding it. So it is both community-based, school-based, and healthcare-based. And then I would think more as well about healthcare access as well, and make sure that low-income children have access to healthcare.
Well, excellent. We will continue this conversation because it's really vitally important, and we will connect it to the post-secondary success that students who are at risk and children at risk can also have. So, Ms. Kellie O'Quinn, Research Director at Children at Risk, we thank you for joining us. Rich conversation today. And we thank you for joining us as well. We hope that you will join us again next time. And always remember to credential up.